H1. The truth about friendship in your golden years. You don't abandon friends as you grow older. You simply outgrow the need for them. Meet Eleanor. She's 74 and lives in Seattle. For 2 decades, she maintained the same routine with 3 companions. Coffee every Tuesday morning, lunch each Thursday afternoon, and a reading circle on Saturdays. Patricia, Diane, and Irene. They were her chosen family, or at least that's what she believed. Then 2 years ago, Eleanor did something most people her age consider unthinkable. She severed all contact, blocked their numbers, deleted their messages, disappeared completely. The whispers started immediately in her community. "What's wrong with Eleanor?" they'd say. "She's different now. How could she just abandon her friends like that?" But here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. A truth that makes people deeply uncomfortable. The individuals closest to you are often the ones slowly poisoning your spirit. Walking away isn't an act of cruelty. It's an act of self-preservation. Be vigilant with people. They'll embrace you warmly in person, then dissect you mercilessly when you're gone. Pleasant on the surface, seething with envy underneath. Only a rare few, perhaps 1%, possess genuinely good hearts. Eleanor discovered this truth the painful way. Today, I'm going to reveal what actually happened to Eleanor, how she found the courage to walk away, and what her existence looks like now, 2 full years later. Hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your age. Let's dive in. It began on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Eleanor drove to the coffee shop, the same establishment where she'd met these women for 20 years. She parked her vehicle, inhaled deeply, and stepped inside. Patricia was already seated at their regular spot beside the window. Eleanor settled across from her, requested her usual coffee, and offered a smile. Patricia's expression remained cold. She launched into conversation immediately. "My daughter's getting divorced again." Eleanor had heard this narrative before, 5 times to be exact, but Patricia continued without pause. "I can't sleep anymore. I lie awake at night thinking about her terrible choices. How did I fail her so completely? What mistakes did I make as a mother?" Eleanor nodded mechanically. She understood her assigned role perfectly. Listen, nod, console. "I'm sure this must be difficult," Dorothy offered gently. "Difficult?" Patricia's voice sharpened. "You can't possibly understand. You don't have a daughter who's been divorced 3 times. Hence, the words stung, but Eleanor remained silent. 10 minutes later, Diane arrived. She collapsed into her chair with an exaggerated sigh. "At least you have a daughter," Diane said to Patricia. "My son refuses to call me, and my daughter-in-law acts like I'm invisible." Eleanor started to speak, but Diane rolled right over her. "Last week, I called 5 times. 5. She ignored every single one. When she finally answered, she claimed she was busy. Busy doing what? Avoiding her mother-in-law?" Patricia immediately jumped back in. "At least your son found someone to marry. My daughter can't maintain a relationship to save her life." The 2 women volleyed back and forth, competing over whose situation was more miserable. Eleanor sat frozen in place, silent. She sipped her coffee, she nodded at the appropriate moments. She smiled when socially required. But inside, she felt hollow. Nobody asked about her life. Nobody noticed she hadn't contributed a single word. Nobody cared. An hour evaporated. Then Irene swept in, fashionably late as always. She wore a new designer coat, clearly expensive. "Apologies for my tardiness," Irene announced, though her tone suggested no actual remorse. "I was at the spa getting a treatment. You know how these things are." Eleanor didn't know. She hadn't indulged in a spa visit in years. Irene settled into her chair and immediately dominated the conversation. "My grandson just received his acceptance letter from Yale. Can you imagine? Yale. I always recognized his brilliance. Patricia's smile looked painful. How wonderful for you. Indeed, Irene continued. And we're organizing our trip to Europe next month. Italy, France, Germany. It's our 4th international vacation this year. Diane's expression hardened. That sounds pleasant. Irene either didn't notice or didn't care. You really should travel more, Diane. It nourishes the soul. Don't just sit home waiting for phone calls that never come. Diane's jaw clenched visibly. Eleanor observed it all unfolding. The veiled aggression, the carefully aimed insults, the toxic cheerfulness masking profound bitterness. This wasn't friendship. This was theater. 2 hours later, they finally dispersed. Eleanor drove home in complete silence. Her grip on the steering wheel was tighter than usual. Her chest felt constricted. Her thoughts raced. Why do I keep subjecting myself to this? When did it become so exhausting? When did I stop finding joy in their presence? She pulled into her driveway and sat motionless for several minutes, staring at nothing. Then she went inside. Her husband, Thomas, was in the living room with his newspaper. "How was coffee?" he asked casually. Eleanor sank into a chair. "Draining." Thomas looked up from his paper. "Then why continue going?" Eleanor stared at the carpet. "I don't know." But she did know, deep down. She continued because she believed she was obligated to. Because they'd maintained this friendship for 20 years. Because leaving felt morally wrong. But staying felt worse. Thomas carefully folded his newspaper. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you don't owe anyone your energy." Eleanor met his eyes. "Even after 20 years? Especially after 20 years, Thomas replied. "Time doesn't make a friendship valuable. Peace does." That night, Eleanor lay awake, thinking. She replayed the cafe conversation, the dismissive remarks, the complete disinterest in her existence, the relentless negativity. She thought about all the instances Patricia had invalidated her emotions. All the times Diane had monopolized every discussion. All the times Irene had diminished her. She thought about the exhaustion she felt after each meeting, how she dreaded the group messages, how she'd begun inventing excuses to avoid them. Trust fractures in tiny moments, when they interrupt and never apologize, when they speak only about themselves and never inquire about you, when they render you invisible within your own friendship. Eleanor's trust was already shattered. She simply hadn't acknowledged it yet. But something transformed that night. A quiet voice within whispered, "You deserve better than this." And for the first time in years, Eleanor truly listened. The following Saturday, Patricia sent a group message. "Lunch next Thursday. Same place as always." Eleanor stared at her phone screen. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She could agree. She could appear. She could endure another 2 hours of complaints and competitions. Or she could finally prioritize herself. She typed, "I'm unavailable." Patricia responded within seconds. "Unavailable? You're always unavailable lately. What's happening with you?" Eleanor didn't reply. Diane chimed in. "Is something wrong?" Irene added, "Have we offended you somehow?" Eleanor switched off her phone. The next day, she did something she'd contemplated for months. She exited the group chat. Her finger trembled as she pressed the button. "Leave group." "Are you certain?" "Yes." For a moment, she felt nothing. Then guilt crashed over her like a wave. 20 years erased. Just like that. But beneath the guilt was something unexpected. Relief. An hour later, Patricia called. Eleanor ignored it. Patricia left a voicemail. "Eleanor, what's going on? Why did you leave the group? Call me immediately." Eleanor deleted the voicemail without listening to it completely. Then Patricia texted directly. "We've been friends for 20 years. You owe us an explanation." Eleanor stared at those words. She typed carefully. I need some time to myself. Patricia's response arrived instantly. Time to yourself? That's all? After everything we've shared together? Eleanor felt her chest constrict. She typed slowly. I apologize. I just need space right now. Patricia wrote back immediately. Space from what? From us? We haven't done anything wrong. You're the one who's changed. Eleanor read the message twice. You're the one who's changed. Perhaps she had changed. Perhaps she'd finally realized she deserved better treatment. She powered off her phone completely. If people don't value your presence, force them to experience your absence. Eleanor was finished being undervalued. A week passed. Eleanor didn't reach out. Neither did Diane or Irene. Only Patricia persisted with messages. I don't understand what happened. What did we do wrong? This is completely unfair. Eleanor didn't respond to any of it. Then one afternoon, her doorbell chimed. It was Diane. Eleanor opened the door reluctantly. May I come inside? Diane asked. Eleanor stepped aside. They sat in the living room. Eleanor prepared tea. Neither woman touched their cup. What's happening? Diane asked. Patricia is devastated. Irene thinks you despise us. Eleanor shook her head slowly. I don't despise anyone. Then why did you leave? Eleanor inhaled deeply. Because I wasn't happy. Diane's face registered confusion. What do you mean? I mean, I felt depleted. Like my purpose was to absorb everyone else's problems, but never to be heard myself. Diane looked wounded. We always listened to you. Did you? Eleanor asked softly. When was the last time you genuinely asked how I was doing? Not out of politeness, but with real interest. Diane opened her mouth, then closed it again. She couldn't recall a single instance. I'm not claiming you're terrible people, Eleanor continued. But our friendship, it stopped feeling like friendship. It felt like an obligation I couldn't escape. Diane stood abruptly. Her expression hardened. I can't believe this. 20 years, Eleanor. 20 years. I know, Eleanor said quietly. But time alone doesn't mean we're beneficial for each other. Diane left without another word. Eleanor closed the door. For the first time in months, she felt weightless. She didn't lose them. They lost access to her. The following days were strange. Eleanor kept anticipating regret, kept waiting for guilt to crush her. But it never materialized. Instead, she felt lighter, as if she'd been carrying an enormous burden for years and finally set it down. Thomas noticed the shift. You seem different, he observed one evening. Different how? Eleanor asked. Happier. More at ease. Eleanor smiled. I think I am. You deserve to be. That night, Eleanor sat by the window, gazing out at the neighborhood. The streetlights glowed softly. The sky was crystalline. The world felt quiet. For the first time in 20 years, her Tuesday was unscheduled. No coffee appointment, no complaints, no comparisons, just space. And it felt magnificent. The first month was disorienting. No Tuesday coffee, no Thursday lunch, no Saturday reading circle. Eleanor's calendar sat empty. Initially, she felt guilty, then lonely, then liberated. She began taking solitary walks. She'd stroll through the neighborhood, past the botanical gardens, along the waterfront. No one to match pace with. No one to complain about joint pain. No one to cut the walk short from fatigue. Just Eleanor and the rhythm of her own footsteps. She noticed details she'd never observed before. The way morning sunlight filtered through leaves. The sound of birdsong. The fragrance of blooming flowers. Walking alone wasn't isolation, it was tranquility. She started frequenting cafes. alone. She'd claim a window seat with a novel and coffee. No interruptions. No judgment about her reading choices. No one dominating the conversation. Just peace. One afternoon, Eleanor was reading at her preferred cafe when another woman sat at the adjacent table. The woman appeared around Eleanor's age, perhaps late 60s. She was alone, absorbed in a book. Eleanor glanced over. The woman looked up and smiled warmly. "Enjoying your book?" the woman asked. Eleanor smiled back. "Getting there. You?" "Likewise." They returned to reading. A few minutes later, the woman spoke again. "I visit here daily," she said. "It's my sanctuary." Eleanor looked up. "From what?" The woman laughed softly. "From people who deplete me." Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition. "I understand exactly what you mean." The woman smiled. "I'm Rachel." "Eleanor." They conversed for an hour. Not about grievances, not about grandchildren, not about comparative suffering. Just life. Books they cherished. Places they'd explored. Dreams they still harbored. It was the first authentic conversation Eleanor had experienced in years. Before parting, Rachel said, "I attend a watercolor painting class at the community center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You should join us." Eleanor hesitated. "I've never painted before." "Neither had I," Rachel said. "But it's peaceful. And the people are genuinely kind." Eleanor considered it. Then she agreed. The following Tuesday, Eleanor entered the community center. The art studio was intimate. 6 easels, soft instrumental music, sunlight streaming through tall windows. Rachel was already there. "You came," she said, beaming. Eleanor smiled back. "I almost didn't. I'm glad you did." Class began. The instructor, a woman in her 50s, guided them through fundamentals. How to grip the brush, how to blend colors, how to embrace the watercolor's natural flow. Eleanor's first attempt was chaotic. Colors bled together, shapes distorted. But nobody laughed, nobody criticized, nobody compared. The instructor said simply, "Beautiful beginning, continue." Eleanor continued. By class end, she'd completed a small landscape. A mountain, a sky, a suggestion of trees. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Rachel glanced over. "That's lovely." Eleanor felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't experienced in years. Pride, not from external validation, but from creation itself. Over subsequent months, Eleanor attended class twice weekly. She met other women, all in their 60s and 70s, all kind, all peaceful. They painted together. They laughed together. They exchanged techniques and encouragement. But they didn't pry. They didn't gossip. They didn't drain. They simply coexisted. One woman, Angela, shared that she'd also severed ties with old friends. "It was the hardest decision I ever made," Angela said, "but also the best." Another woman, Gloria, nodded. "I spent 40 years with the same group. When I finally left, I felt like I could breathe properly again." Eleanor realized she wasn't alone. Thousands of women her age were making this identical choice. Choosing tranquility over history. Choosing themselves over obligation. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt authentic. Your lifelong companion is yourself. Eleanor was finally befriending herself again. 6 months after her departure, Eleanor encountered Patricia at the supermarket. Their eyes locked across the produce section. Patricia immediately looked away, grabbed her cart, and hurried to a different aisle. Eleanor felt a pang of melancholy, but not regret. She continued shopping, selected tomatoes, greens, fresh bread. As she approached checkout, she passed Irene in the cereal aisle. Irene spotted her, hesitated, then forced a tight smile. "Eleanor." "Irene." An uncomfortable silence. "How have you been?" Irene asked stiffly. "Well," Eleanor said honestly. "Really well." Irene's smile wavered. That's good to hear. Another pause. Well, Irene said, take care of yourself. You too. Irene departed quickly. Eleanor stood there momentarily. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel guilt. She felt neutral. These women were no longer part of her life, and that was acceptable. She completed her purchase and drove home. Thomas was in the garden. I saw Patricia and Irene today, Eleanor mentioned. Thomas looked up. How did it go? Awkward, but manageable. Do you regret it, walking away? Eleanor considered the question. No, she said. I don't. Thomas smiled. Good. A year passed. Eleanor completed her 10th watercolor painting. She hung it in the corridor, alongside the others. Thomas stepped back to admire the collection. You've become quite skilled, he said. Thank you, Eleanor said, smiling. Each painting represented a moment of calm, a moment of focus, a moment of self. She was 75 now. 1 year had elapsed since she'd walked away, and she'd never been more content. Eleanor and Rachel began taking day excursions together. They drove to the coastline, walked the beaches, painted the ocean. They drove to the mountains, hiked gentle paths, painted the forests. They didn't discuss their problems. They didn't complain. They didn't compare. They simply embraced the present moment. One afternoon, sitting on a bench, overlooking Puget Sound, Rachel said something profound. You know what I've realized? Rachel said. What? Old age is a time to curate your life, to release what no longer serves your well-being. Eleanor nodded. Most people cling to relationships out of guilt, Rachel continued. But guilt isn't a valid reason to stay. Eleanor thought about Patricia, Diane, Irene. She'd felt guilty for months after leaving. But now, a year later, the guilt had evaporated. In its place was peace. Another year passed. Eleanor was 76 now, 2 full years since her departure. She still painted each morning. She still met Rachel once or twice weekly. But she didn't require constant companionship anymore. She was comfortable in her own presence. One evening, Eleanor and Thomas sat on the porch watching the sunset. Do you ever think about them? Thomas asked. Sometimes, Eleanor admitted, but I don't miss them. What do you miss? Thomas asked. Eleanor pondered the question. I miss the concept of them, she said. The idea of lifelong friendship. But the reality? I don't miss that at all. Thomas nodded knowingly. They sat in comfortable silence. The sky transformed from orange to rose to deep violet. Eleanor felt content, not because she possessed everything, but because she'd released what was weighing her down. In a world where marriages dissolve and parents become estranged from children, being alone in your later years is nothing to mourn. Eleanor understood now. This wasn't loneliness. This was freedom. The lessons. Today. Eleanor is 76. She still paints every morning. She still meets Rachel once or twice weekly for coffee. But she doesn't need constant company. She doesn't need validation. She doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Eleanor learned 3 critical truths. First, old friends aren't automatically good friends. Comfort matters infinitely more than history. 20 years means nothing if those years were saturated with resentment, comparison, and negativity. A friendship should enrich your life, not deplete it. Second, old age is a time to curate your life, to release what no longer serves you. You don't possess endless energy anymore. You don't have unlimited time. Invest both in people who elevate you, not those who diminish you. Third, being alone doesn't equal being lonely. It means being free. Eleanor had spent 20 years surrounded by people who rendered her invisible. Now she was alone, but she felt seen by herself. And that was sufficient. The truth nobody tells you. Eleanor's story isn't unique. Thousands of women and men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s are severing toxic friendships every single day. Not because they're heartless, but because they've finally learned to value themselves. Some people possess no boundaries. They extract and extract without remorse. And when you finally walk away, they don't even care. So don't feel guilty for choosing yourself. You didn't lose them. They lost access to you. You don't lose friends as you age. You stop needing them. And that's perfectly okay. If you've ever felt this way, drop a comment. Tell me how many friendships you've walked away from. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. H2, H2, P, 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 T. I'll end with a line tending sentence.